Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the launch for André Alexis's Ring. My name is Elena Wilcox from Coach House Books, and I'll be hosting you for the evening. Thank you all for, showing up on Zoom. I know we're all tired of Zoom, but here we are. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that Coach House, where this book was printed and everything else, is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties. And this week, on the eve of Truth and Reconciliation Day, we're especially conscious of that relationship and the work that we have to do. Ring, which you're all here to hear about, is the final installment in the Quincunx, which is a singular achievement in Canadian letters. It is, to my mind, massive in ambition, precise in execution, elusive, erudite, and a rollicking good read to boot. It's been my great honor at Coach House and as André's editor for the last, I think, 8 years to be working closely with André as we've produced the 5 books that make up the Quincunx. I'm very, very proud of the series and honored to have been a part of it. Ring, the last of the 5, is a romance. This is, of course, not the romance you might expect. It's as if we collided Danielle Steele and Martin Heidegger. I'm not going to tell you any more about the plot. I'm going to introduce our 2 conversationalists for the evening. Nick Mount professes English for the University of Toronto, mostly Canadian literature. His latest book is Arrival, The Story of CanLit, which Anansi published in 2017 and should be required reading for all of us. And of course, the man who needs no introduction, André Alexis, the author of this here Ring and the Quincunx. André has written many books, notably 15 Dogs, which won all the prizes, including the Giller. Many of his other books won many of the other prizes. I'm not going to go into them all. But what I do want to say about André is that he's a good friend, a great collaborator, and it's bittersweet for me to be finishing up working with him on this Quincunx, this massive project. So I'm going to duck out and let André and Nick tell you a little bit about, or talk a little bit about the Quincunx.
Thank you, Alana.
Thanks, Elena.
Good to see you, André. You got out of Berlin.
Wait, I forgot one thing.
Yes.
I'll be coming back in the last 15 minutes. If you want to leave any questions for André or Nick, you can just put them in the Q&A and we will tackle those questions at the end. Sorry, here I go.
So when did you manage to get out of Berlin? That's where you were last time we digitally saw each other.
Oh, I had a fun time getting out of Berlin because I was stopped for 2 hours because it turned out that I was illegally in Berlin for 9 months. The German Academy had forgotten to do the paperwork that allows me to stay in Berlin. So when I got to the airport in Frankfurt, I was held by customs for 4 hours and missed my flight. And what was kind of amusing, it was stressful at the time, was that, of course, you have to have your test 72 hours in front, right, before you can travel. I made the following day's plane by 45 minutes. I just got on the plane as my 72 hours was expiring. So I was illegally in Berlin and got out after paying a 450 euro fine.
Welcome home.
Thank you.
I'm glad to hear the story has a happy ending.
It doesn't change my feelings about the city. I adore Berlin. I seriously adore it.
Well, let's start where Alana left off, because as she said, I mean, this is pretty big. I mean, writers spend a lot of time with books, but this is 5 books. This is the center of a pattern that you have been weaving since, well, before Pastoral. I'd say starting with A. And I want just to ask it to reflect a bit about how does it feel to be done? I mean, what is it? Will you miss these people?
Well, the first thing to say is that I'm not done. I had always planned to do I guess you could call it an omnibus edition of all five. And so Alana and I have been talking about just doing a 1-volume edition, but I don't want it to be just the 5 novels thrown together and repackaged. For me, I wanted to rewrite, rethink, add things, take things out, everything to make sure that the pattern, the time, the names even from book to book all absolutely add up. Like you'll notice if you've read all 5 books that there's a dog called Bruno in Pastoral, and then there's a professor called Bruno, and then there's a list of professors, all of whom have the name Brown but in different languages. It's like playing with names and identities all through, and I just want to make sure that I get all of those straight and get the sense of place right. So just reading Pastoral again and reading through all 5 novels and thinking them as a unit, as opposed to, these tessera in a mosaic.
Do you think you'll be able to resist the temptation to make changes more substantial than corrections?
Yes, because I have the really wonderful example of Henry James, who rewrote his early work for the New York editions and destroyed them. He turned all of his early style, which at least had a clarity to it, into the mush-mouthed later style. I know there's some people who prefer the later style, but
they're crazy.
Yeah, they're really hard to read.
There's no help for those people, Andre.
No. So with that example in mind, it's sort of like, okay, that's fine. I'll make sure not to ruin it, or try not to.
For a minute there, I thought there was somebody at your door. I know almost everybody here is likely to know this, but just as a refresher, because this story goes back quite a few years, can you just briefly explain the relationship between this series and the 1968 Italian film that inspired it in the first place, just as a sort of starting point?
Yeah, I'm not a huge Pier Paolo Pasolini fan. I like him fine. I find him difficult, but interesting. But there's something about Teorema that just got me. And when I first saw it, I thought what I was interested in was the family. If you know the story, it's a person played by Terence Stamp who, for some reason, visits and stays with a family: father, mother, daughter, son, and a housemaid. And through the course of the film, he sleeps with all of them, which has its consequences. Most everybody's happy to sleep with him. The trouble starts when he leaves. And that's when all of them are changed irrevocably. The son becomes an artist. The daughter is catatonic, I think, at the end, and so on, with the housemaid levitating and performing miracles. So there was a corollary there to a visitation by ancient Greek gods and the giving of some sort of gift. And I was fascinated by the family and tried to rewrite Teorema based on the family dynamic. And I just failed. I just constantly did bad versions of Pier Paolo Pasolini's work. It wasn't until I kind of understood that what really got to me was the idea of divinity. Now, it's not clear in the movie that Terence Stamp is a god, but the presence of God and then the withdrawal of God, which feels like the presence of Terence Stamp and then when he leaves, was really what interested me. And at that point, I thought of a number of ways I could deal with the intervention of the divine. And I thought about, well, what is the divine and how can that be portrayed? And so each of the novels is a response to the divine, to the idea of the divine, but it's also meditations on different ideas: power, love, place. You can list them. They're all dealing with those ideas that somewhat also come from the movie. I mean, I think it would be interesting to watch the movie and then spend all the time reading the novels, because I think it's probably subconsciously influenced me in ways that I can't talk to you about because I don't know.
Yeah, but centered around the notion of the divine visitation. It's not just the divine, it's the connection of the divine with the human, right? The interaction.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, quite right.
Yeah. Can I just share something with you? If we can all see this here, if you can see it. That's a painting on the screen. If you can you see it all right, Andre?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, so that's
the Ambassadors by Holbein.
Yeah, and so for those of you who haven't read the book yet, one of the characters in the book, the central character in the book, is a huge fan of this particular painting. And I won't say anything more than that right now, but she points out, or one of the characters points out, that the floor that the men are standing on has a quincunx design on it. And forgive me, Andre, this is why I had to bring it up, is that another character says about the painting, he says, the whole painting's so suggestive, which, you know, as a critic and a reader, I have to think maybe you're trying to tell us something there.
Well, so I have a personal and emotional relationship to that painting. I was in London after a breakup, and I visited the National Gallery every day for, I think it was 40 days, 30 or 40 days. I can't remember now, it's so long ago. And I looked at this painting constantly, along with the early Renaissance paintings. It was just my way of, I suppose, leaving a relationship. The person that I was in a relationship, Linda, who did the illustrations for Ring and did the illustrations for Days by Moonlight, that was my breakup with her. And the art was what was her favorite. So when I'm looking at that, I'm also thinking of Linda. I'm also thinking of the emotions of a breakup, but I'm also thinking of how deeply suggestive, in the sense that, well, what does that loop mean? What does the globe signify? Each of the things that is contained in that, from the green of the curtain to the ermine that one is wearing, has a significance that is slightly hidden and slightly revealed. And I love that aspect of the painting above all, except of course for the anamorphic skull there, which is death, but death shaped in a weird way. So even that is suggestive and not quite as you would normally see it. And I think you could say that programmatically, in all of the novels, in all the 5 novels, objects will come back. They will come back in different forms. They'll come back in different contexts, and thematic ideas come back in different contexts and change. So part of the reason that I did a bunch of different genres is that it occurred to me how different it is when you see the word God in a detective story, as opposed to in a romance, as opposed to in a cowboy novel. All of those different environments changes our idea of what, you know, the divine might be, or what love might be, or what power might be. And it was it intrigued me to think of having a certain set of ideas that are put through the ringer of the different genres, and you sort of see them differently. So that painting is really influential in my thinking about how a thing can be obvious and not obvious, and how the change in context, the taking it out of the real world and putting it into the creative world, subtly changes one's sense of it as well.
Yeah. I like that. Everything hints at something else.
Yes, everything hints at something else.
Yeah. When you were describing this series back in, this is now 2015, you referred to this one, which wasn't yet written, as a kind of Harlequin romance. Mm-hmm. And the back cover, which I know, you know, you didn't necessarily write, that's not how it works, but the back cover of this one refers to it as, it says it turns a literary romance, the literary romance, upside down and shakes it. Is that right? Yeah, turns the literary romance upside down and shakes it. Yeah, at least in my world, the literary romance and the Harlequin romance don't mean the same thing. And what I'm wondering about is, did you change your mind, or do those two terms mean the same thing to you?
They don't. And I want to talk about that slightly, because there's a certain amount of scorn for Harlequin romances, which is very ironic for me because I'm a reader of the Oulipians, the Ouvres de littérature potentielle. So I'm a fan of Georges Perec and Italo Calvino and Harry Matthews in particular. The Ouvres de littérature potentielle was developed as a kind of way to use mathematics and literature together. We already know that the sonnet is 14 lines and so on and so forth, and has a mathematical equation behind it almost. And so that they have a precedence in that, sonnet form and so on. And I was really interested in formal constraint. But when you think of a Harlequin romance in particular, the formal constraints are insane. You have to have this kind of literature mentioned. You have to have it take place in this kind of place. You have to use this kind of language. It has to be no longer than this. I mean, they give you a page of constraints that you have to follow. The big danger of them is that, of course, they all tell the same story, and they're all in some senses cliched, but they're all playing on something that we want to read about the notion of love and whatnot. So that kind of keeps you going through them. But formally, they're monsters. I think the only thing that would be more difficult would be trying to find a vampire story that was new. So I want that the Harlequin thing, the absolute constraint in literature as part of what I'm doing. I like that. It's interesting. Yeah. And also, it's not obvious when you think about Harlequin romances that they are formally very, very tricky things to write. I mean, to read, they're fun, and you don't even notice maybe the formal qualities to them. But as a writer, man, they're like doing math.
Yeah. As a student of Canadian literary history, I also appreciate that it connects your work to a Canadian literary tradition, because of course Harlequins is a Canadian.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
One other question about something that may or may not have changed. This was in a conversation, I think just the two of us a couple of years ago, and you told me at the time you were still thinking about Ring, and you said that it might go to Africa. It didn't. Did it at any point end up going to Africa in the draft? And did you change your mind about that, or that just never made it into the finished version?
No, it did. In the sense that the main character, Guinevere, inherits a ring that comes from far, far back. And so its roots are in Africa. The main problem I had was that I wanted to talk about ocean. I wanted to talk about a specific goddess. And as I came to write, I realized, first of all, although my family has roots in Kenya, I'm not Kenyan. I'm not actually a believer or a part of that religion. And all of a sudden, it just really blocked me to use a god and a tradition that is only nominally mine, but isn't in fact mine. And so I had to turn it in a way towards the Western, which I was more comfortable with. And I had to turn it towards the Greeks because I've known Greek literature, the Greek pantheon, since I was a child. It's the one that, in some ways, aside from the Christian, I'm most at home with. And I think you could also talk about the novels as being the interplay of the Christian and the Greek. It's like the religious ideas are very Christian and also Greek really come to wrestle it out throughout the 5 novels, I think.
Yeah, I may have misunderstood you. I meant in terms of setting, like actually being set part of it now.
Oh, setting. No, yeah. That was briefly my idea, but no.
Okay.
It was more getting at Ocean, the god, that I was interested in. Setting it in Africa would have presented the same kind of problems.
Yeah.
I'm not African. I haven't been there, and it would have been tricky to talk about that.
So, Ocean, it was a good transition because Ocean shows up in at least one of the others.
In Hidden Keys, yeah.
In Hidden Keys, yeah. And we meet a lot of you are about to meet, friends and fans. You were about to meet a lot of characters you've met before. Tancred from the Hidden Keys, the surviving Azarians. I won't go through all of them because I don't want to, but Robbie shows up from Pastoral, and that Liz off stage, Professor Bruno and briefly Alfred Homer from Days by Moonlight. There are no, this is just a small question, Andre, but there are no, to me, obvious survivors from 15 Dogs. I mean named dogs. Is that because they're all dead? Or at the time of this?
No, actually, there is one, but you'd have to look for it.
I know where it is.
The Greek name Margos means the crazy one, and the Persian name Majnun means the crazy one. So Margos, the hero of the poem in the center of Ring, is a transcribed version of Majnun. So they share a name, but in different languages.
Oh, I love that. Okay, all right. There's also an Alsatian at one point in the book that seems rather conspicuously identified.
There is?
Yeah. I'll show you later.
Where's this Alsatian? No,
Page 100. It's okay.
I don't remember all these details, actually.
Let's leave that one be. I love that about Margos. Okay. Margos is you'll meet Margos. Margos is also, of course, a talking dog. So in that sense,
Yes.
Yeah. 15 Dogs opens up at the Wheat Sheaf, I think it is.
Yes.
Toronto's oldest tavern. I guess nowadays more of a sports bar in some ways. And Ring opens up at the Gardener. They're both very, very Toronto. Both sort of what I think of at least as epitomes of different kinds of Toronto, but very different places, very different crowds. And then some of the characters in the beginning of this one sort of remark upon. So what I'm getting is, was class important to Ring at all, to the particular story that it tells? Is there something about this romance that money matters?
I want to say one thing before I answer that question, because as we talk about the poem and I see Christian Book's name, I realize I should mention how Christian is in Ring. I wanted originally to do an incantation in a non-language, and I asked Christian if he would write lines of an incantation that rhymed and so on for me, and do it as if it came from an African language, but not a nonsensical one. And he did. But when I put it through Google Translate, it actually translated into something in Swahili. I don't know whether he even actually knew that he was using Swahili when he did the incantation for me. So we were talking about Africa, right? So Christian did this version of the African, but because it could translate into something, I had to not use it. So what I did instead was I rewrote it using different languages from the four corners of the earth. It's totally nonsensical. Google can't translate it, but it contains elements of the human languages from all over. So it was my way of altering Christian. As to what was the question before you were talking about that?
I was just wondering if in what way, I mean, class isn't the right word, but it's just...
No, class is a good word. No, class is a good word. Class is a word that does have an influence on me. For me, my father was worried that I have to start by saying that my parents are from Trinidad. My mother was slightly better off than my father in that her father was a shopkeeper, and they had their own place. My father had a place in Belmont that was incredibly poor, and his anxiety about making it, about getting out of Belmont, about having enough money so that his kids would not have to live in a place like Belmont was really just part of my... So class anxiety is something that is, yes, it's subterranean, not even subterranean. It's part of my view of the world. It's not that I aspire to hang out with Conrad Black. I don't. And it's not that I aspire to hang out with anybody. It's just that I'm aware in Canada of those breaks in the same way that I suppose my father was. I don't know what the ultimate significance of class is, but it's there as part of the background of how I write and what I write about.
I guess what I was getting at is like, is there some connection between wealth and the Harlequin romance? Is this a Silver Fork romance? Was that part of where you were going for?
Yes, no, that's well caught, Nick. Yes, one of the Harlequin romances that I read in preparation was called, oh God, I can't remember. I'd have to look at the book now. And it was all about wealth, which is why there is scenes of wealth in this one, and why there's an elaborate dinner in a restaurant, which took place in that book as well. It was really lovely doing the dinner scenes for me, because I asked a chef, a professional chef who stars at Noma, to write those menus for me. So there are 2 menus in the novel, and both of them are created by Ben Spiegel, who's a really good chef. So it was my way of having a little bit of, I suppose, a different class, a different thing right within the book. And also I really love the random and the unexpected, to just show up and I have to work my way around them in the work. But yes, it comes a little from the novel that I read from Harlequin. Playing by the Greeks' rules, that's what it was called.
Okay. I don't want to tell you how much time I spent trying to find an anagram in those menus.
Sorry, there was none.
I was pretty convinced you did. It just, anyway. So Michael, for Michael, we're sticking to place here a bit,
yes.
Play the places of the book. Michael, who's Professor Bruno's lover, you haven't met him yet. This is just a line in the book. It says, for Michael.
Not a him. Not a him.
Not a him, a them.
Them, yeah.
That is correct.
Very definitely.
That is correct.
And I don't actually, it was difficult to write Michael without using a pronoun. But Michael is definitely not he or she.
No, you're great way. So for Michael, your line, Southern Ontario aroused both love and a longing to flee. Is there something of you in that statement? I mean, I know how much your fiction has been. There's a lot here, but Southern Ontario is the heartland of a lot of your fiction from the beginning to now. Is that true in any way for you? That description, aroused both love and a longing to flee?
No, I don't think so. I feel uncomfortable wherever I go. So every place on earth arouses the longing to flee. Not Southern Ontario in particular, but no, actually, for me, Southern Ontario is evocative of my childhood, is evocative of growing up. And as such, it's extremely precious to me. Growing up in Petrolia had its disadvantages. I mean, we were the only Black family in town for a long time. So it was, for someone who's self-conscious anyway, it was made me even more self-conscious. But I love the smells, the sounds, the feel of Southern Ontario a lot. And it's part of who I am in a deep way. And so when I describe Petrolia or Sarnia, I feel very connected to my childhood, and it's a lovely experience.
More so than Ottawa at this point, or are they just different memories?
They're equal. They both have a kind of equal status within my psyche in a way, Ottawa and Southern Ontario. And now Toronto, because trying to understand Toronto, trying to describe it has become part of what the Quincunx was as well. Like in Hidden Keys, one of the kind of premises was that what would I lose if I could never see Toronto again? And I allowed that sense of the loss of Toronto, what would I lose, to inform the descriptions of Hidden Keys. So Hidden Keys is both a description of Toronto and a kind of valediction, a goodbye, like this is the version of you that I would keep in mind in extremis, for the city. The lake obviously is like hugely important for me.
We were talking just before we started this about, the Wheat Chief now being among the many casualties of the pandemic. Well, I assume, it's closed. I just wondered, is any part of, because there's, this is one of the things I quite frankly love about your your fiction is that it's still fairly unusual in this country, André, to read fiction that unabashedly declares it's here. The names are streets, the names are places, and you've been doing that for a while, and it's something I've always appreciated. I wonder, especially given some of the places that are named in your fiction, because you do name such specific places, actual bars, taverns, etc. They're now gone. Is recapturing any of that at all part of the impulse of the fiction? Is there a documentary impulse at all to your descriptions of a Toronto or Southern Ontario?
I wouldn't say that you're wrong, Nick, but I'm not sure it's documentary. I think that it comes a little bit from the anxiety of, again, so I was born in Trinidad, and when I first came to Ottawa, the world was something that existed to be interpreted so that I could figure out what was what and where was what. And that kind of impulse has stayed with me. So there is, in naming a place and naming a brand of beer, Old Vienna would be my dad, being able to have that concretely there is part of the anxiety about, being Canadian for me. But there's something else that I really love about using real names, real places, real beers. And that is that when you see them in the fictional environment, they change. They're somewhat different. If a god is drinking Sleeman's, that feels different somehow. And so my huge thing is the imagination. I adore the imagination, and it's probably really the subject of all my work. The imagination works. Genre is a perfect way to examine that. But so is mixing the real and the unreal, because you can sort of see the edges of one and the other. So using real names and real places is a way to feel that shifting point between what is and what is imagined. And it's a way for me of like insisting on what is interesting about the imagination, the creation of place, for instance.
Yeah, no, we're on the same page. You're right. Documentary is not the right word. What I love about
it's close.
But the appearance of a real street in your fiction is not that, for me, that it records the real street. Is that the street itself gets transformed into something extraordinary as a consequence of its appearance in the fiction, something different. Yeah. There's a line Gwen says after Gwen reads the books that accompany The Rings. She says she feels like she's now living in a world that looked like hers, but that fundamentally was not.
Yes.
And that's how I feel, reading your fiction. That twisted mirror just a few degrees off. Anyway.
Well, it's because it's the unimaginable for her. It's very rare that we have an encounter with the real that shifts into something else. I mean, I think for us, the common one that we probably share is 9/11, where we all can remember where we are and how the world was before that and how it changed after that, that there's a collective sense that there's a shift into something unimaginable. We've recovered, I suppose, in some ways, or maybe we haven't, but it's a node in which the unimaginable changes the day-to-day. A pretty fascinating and, in that case, horrifying event, but also one that religious writers talk about all the time, which is the descent of the mysterious or the miraculous, also transfiguring the day-to-day. So these transfigurations of the day-to-day are really important to me, I guess, as things to poke at, as interesting points.
If a bottle of beer, a real bottle of beer like Labatt's or Sleeman's, gets transformed when it puts in the fiction into, not quite the real Sleeman's, something like another Sleeman's because it's being held by a god, is the same thing true of the many real people that you put in your fiction? And here I'm thinking in particular of your affection for putting in people from the Canadian literary world in. So in this book, Rue Borson, I think Jan Zwicky shows up. There's a statue of Gwen McEwen, which is amazing. And this is a new one. There's a cameo by your own publisher who looks to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that she's about to reject the manuscript of Days by Moonlight or something close to a version of Days by Moonlight. Anyway, I just enjoyed the heck out of all this. But what I'm really asking is, is that also true for the real people when you put them in your fiction? Does Jan Zwicky and here Rue Borson become different? The real.
I think Rue would say that she is different because I've imagined her in a way that is different from how she sees herself naturally. But that was particular to Ring. So there's two things. Poetry is supremely important for me in this sequence. And there's no surprise that there's a long, like almost 500 line poem at the center of Ring. That poem is also at the center of the Quincunx, the direct center. And it has a personal meaning. My mother read poetry to me. She read the Rime of the Ancient Mariner to me when I was 8 or 9. And the experience of being in a big chair with my mom and reading poetry is something that is fundamental to my kind of aesthetic self. And so insofar as there is a poem at the center of Ring, it is for the love of my mother. Ring is in some ways a love letter to my mom. But there was also throughout all of the novels a constant mentioning of poetry, not only as my mom, but also of home, because that was the place where I encountered poetry. And that's why poetry is so personal to me. But in this book, it's less, or it is like Rue is in there, and Jan is in there, and Gwendolyn McEwen is in there, and Lisa Robertson is in there. Less because they represent, my relationship to poetry, and more because Ring is itself a combining of two things. Like it is it's joining all the other novels, but it's also a joining of the real and the unreal. So there are actual people and actual places mixed in, and actual events mixed in with purely imagined ones. And there's personal details and public details. Like if you had gone out with me and your name was X, you would recognize certain streets, certain buildings, because I'm directly referring to my relationship with you. Elaine, who's my current partner, is actually in the book, not by her real name, but by, I guess, her second name, and her daughter's in it, and her mother is in it. But you wouldn't know that as a general reader. There's a bringing together of the personal and the impersonal, the public and the private. Ring is a connector. And classically rings do that, right? They serve as a symbol of marriage because of that, the connection. And so in order to be honest to what the nature of Ring is, it's shaped like a ring in that it goes like this in terms of its sections. And also it is a connecting, the real and the unreal, all those things.
That's great. So there's parts of this that are private.
Yes. Definitely, and you're not, and it's not necessarily it's not necessarily important that you know what they are, but I do feel like when you use things that your readers don't know, you're still using them for the feeling that they contain. That there is something about how you feel about a shoe, a window, a certain view of the lake that will, on the surface, be just bunch of words, a quick description, but that they're imbued with your own feeling. And that I think maybe the reader can catch that, if not all the time, at least some of the time, and they can feel the significance of the Wheat Sheep Tavern, for instance.
No, that makes sense to me. It's hard to communicate feeling if you don't feel it yourself. So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I really just have one last question, but it's maybe a big one, and then we'll take some questions from it. And I see Carl is just correct. I put in the most necessary correction of the evening, which is that apparently the Wheat Chief is still opening. So I hope we didn't just do them any harm there. Go to the Wheat Chief. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, I can recommend the macaroni and tomato soup.
So in the Hidden Keys, you may have already answered this in some ways, but it's just Willow is convinced that studying the 5 objects closely will lead to a hidden treasure. And as a consequence of that, there was a review at the time in the Globe and Mail, Jose Teodoro, who wondered, and he wasn't the only one wondering this, if the 5 novels in the Quincunx would eventually align in some way as to direct readers towards, his word, secret swag.
No. I wish I was rich enough to do something like that, but my secret swag would be like a box of Smarties. No one's going to read 5 novels for a box of Smarties.
Okay, but presumably he meant some part of that joke seriously, that the 5 of them together reveal something that individually they don't.
Yes, in the sense that, as I said, when you are in a pastoral and God is discussed, it's different than when you are in a romance and God is discussed. It's different from when you are in a mystery and the non-presence of God is discussed. The swag is that, in a way, you get to see the things that are obvious from your day-to-day life, the things that you know, or you think you know well, and you get to see them from a slightly different and odd angle, which, if you're lucky, renews your relationship with them. And in that renewal of the day-to-day, that's the biggest reward I think that literature can give. I mean, I don't think there's, for instance, any way that I could talk about anything new about love, or new about God, or new about any of these concepts. I'm not really interested in innovative thinking in that way. I'm interested in putting them forward so that we can see them from different angles. And it's that seeing them from different angles that is the most important thing for me. I guess in that sense, I'm totally a Shklovsky, Viktor Shklovsky, and the Russian formalist critics. I'm totally in their camp when they talk about literature as being a way of making the familiar strange again. Mm-hmm. It's Brecht uses it from there as well, that, you know, you come to this place where apparently I'm telling you about things that you know, but you're seeing them from an unusual and unexpected angle, and in that way they enter into your life again, you know, in a vivid way, briefly, for as long as they can, for as long as you can hold them as new, but at least for that moment maybe they're renewed, and that's not a bad treasure.
That seems like a good point, Alana, if you're there to come in and start taking some questions from people. I'll just say
I'm here.
Awesome. That, you know, one there is in a way kind of swag, and the ring is literally hidden, right? It's literally hidden inside a box. You have to turn the right things to present it.
Yes.
But your answer is a lot better than that. Anyway,
we don't have any questions yet in the Q&A. I'm hoping somebody in the audience wants to know something.
It can't be because we've covered everything.
There's a lot to cover. There's a lot going on in those 5 books.
They're also just fun. I hope they're also just fun to read. I mean, you know,
they are.
It's not like I was. Yeah, I hope it's not like we're doing deep works of philosophy or anything.
We have a question from Robert McGill. Thanks for a fascinating conversation, Andre and Nick.
Robert.
Andre, I'm wondering, what were among the most significant ways in which your vision for the Quincunx changed over the course of writing it?
It's a question about what's still changing, Robert. I mean, I sort of have a different idea of the organization of the whole, having finished it and seen what are the constituent elements of it. So I now know the 5 novels, and I now know kind of how they shape out and how they form. And so my sense of each novel is changing, and my sense of what I'd like to fix in them is changing. So I guess the answer to that question is that in the creation of the novels, in the creation of the group of novels, my sense of what they should be has altered. I get a deeper understanding of the novels and the idea of the quincunx as I go forward. Interesting.
Well, some things changed, right? I mean, I think Tancred ended up occupying a bigger space than you had originally
intended. Yes, that's true. Tancred, yes. Thank you, editor. Maybe that is in fact the best answer, that the reappearance of Tancred and Robert was unexpected. The story I knew was going to be a romance, but that reappearance was unexpected.
Was that because you became fond of Tancred in ways that you hadn't anticipated? A character you felt you had more to say about?
I have to say, Nick, he is the single most frustrating character I've ever had to write. I still feel like he is incredibly guarded, that he doesn't want to tell me about himself, that you will never come to the end of what Tancred is. And it's not like I didn't try. I almost feel like I need to write another novel. Although the frustration of a character who's keeping his distance from you is so difficult, so difficult. But I mean, I couldn't just assign him qualities. I couldn't assign him behavior, because it was, if I knew, it's as if I knew what not to write about him, but not the other side, which is what to write about him. And so there's something guarded and inexpressible for me in him. And of course, he's a thief. He has a shadow self, and he guards that shadow self from me too.
That's what Gwen loves about him. He's a man of mystery. So you're checking the formula box at the same time, right?
Well, I also think that it's it is part of the process of loving to discover what the other person is. The journey towards uncovering what the other person is isn't a non-part of love. It is maybe love itself. And in both directions, when you, if for instance, you find out that you don't have the feeling for that person and you sort of uncouple, then that too is part of the process that love is. Love sometimes gets thought of as a thing, a positive thing, but it isn't. I think it's a process. And to talk about that process as a journey towards another, that journey is itself love, as opposed to a journey towards love,
Okay, we have a bunch more questions. Cool. The poem read at times like a theater script, or was that just my perception?
Who said that?
Anonymous.
Did it read like a theater script? Well, you know that it's being done by Crow's Theatre, which I think is
15 dogs.
Amazing. Oh, okay. Oh, that's right. That's dogs. Oh, did the poem in the middle of Ring feel like it could have been theatrical? The answer to that is yes, because how I originally thought of the poem was as I mentioned earlier that one of my essential experiences of poetry is my mom reading poetry to me. I imagined somebody reading that poem. Its speakingness, its vocalness, its communicating story to somebody else was a definite part of how I imagined it. And I do think of being around a campfire and telling a good story as being the essence of the theatrical. So yes, the answer to that question is yes, and that's well spotted.
The publisher will put in a little plug for the forthcoming audiobook.
Oh yes, it's true.
Yes. Along the same lines, Sean Dixon wants to know if you're participating in the rehearsals for the Crow's Theatre adaptation of 15 Dogs.
I'm not, and I'm like super interested in what they're going to do. Marie Farsi is the director. Crow's Theatre is producing it. They have had rehearsals for it, but I haven't had anything to do with those rehearsals. So I'm assuming that when it comes to seeing the stage version of 15 Dogs, I'll be as surprised as anybody else. It may be a 7-hour extravaganza or a half-an-hour one. I don't know how the process will end up. I'm looking forward to it, though. I'm looking forward to it partly because I don't have anything to do with it.
Tricia wants to know which of the novels you most enjoyed writing.
That's an interesting question because I can think of it two ways. The novel that I love most is Days by Moonlight. The novel that I enjoyed most writing was Pastoral. And you have to remember, well, for those who don't know, which is everybody, I wrote Pastoral while I was in London, England, at my friend Jane's house. I got up every morning and wrote. The names of it come from a chapel of the dead in the Lake District. I just took down all the names of the dead and used their names in Pastoral. The process felt, it took me 3 months and I wrote that novel, and it was the most glorious time I've ever had writing anything. I was deeply immersed in it. You know, being able to write something day after day after day is a really lovely part of the process. But it was also as if I really was inhabited by something else. And so not in a negative way, in an exhilarating way. And there hasn't been anything to touch it in my life. But it's not my favorite novel in that I feel like Days by Moonlight gets at a version of home and Canada and Dante and, you know, a lot of my influences in a very surprising way. And so writing it was like, you know, I talked about how having, you know, the day-to-day turned into something new is part, I hope, of what is rewarding for readers. Well, writing that novel was an estrangement of Canada for me, which was really lovely. I sort of got to experience the country differently while writing it. So it is my favorite. I like 15 Dogs too. Lots of money.
Speaking of the Lake District, hello, Will Smith. So you're asking a question about the UK. We do not have a publisher lined up for this one in the UK, but you're welcome to drop me a note if you know anyone who'd be interested. We have a question. Is there an element of making the world as you would like it to be, such as the honoring of poets in Ring, the good food in unexpected places in others?
Hi, Deborah. No, I don't think so. There's nothing kind of utopian in how I write, but I kind of understand that because there is something about imagining those places that can feel as if it's utopian, I suppose. The concentration on food, the concentration on pleasure that exists in Ring can feel like it's something that I would want, but it's not. I'm really just not executing a program, but trying to feel my way through various sensations and feelings. Not necessarily my ideal ones, but you know, the ones that my characters allowed me to feel through them.
Although I don't think you'd turn down those meals. I certainly wouldn't.
No, no, I really wouldn't. I do have an ideal book launch, which is that Ben Spiegel, the chef, prepares that meal, the first meal, for us all. That would be very good.
I'm in. Mark asks, the Hidden Keys is described as a quest narrative. Was there anything in particular about quest narratives that excited you tremendously but couldn't make the final edit? So we're jumping back to the Hidden Keys.
Yes. The Hidden Keys is a book that cheats in a way. It doesn't cheat, but it doesn't follow the quest novel precisely. In a precisely followed quest novel, all of the clues would lead you and lead the main character directly to whatever the ending is. They do, but by accident. Tancred thinks something or discovers something internally, and it's kind of random that he arrives at the solution. There is place for the random in Hidden Keys. Olivier's in there, and Olivier believes in the random as well. You know, he's a believer in chance, and chance plays a really big role in Hidden Keys. So I always feel like I kind of cheated by bringing pure chance in, but it was kind of looking at chance and necessity in writing that book anyway. If I were going to rewrite it, I would rewrite it with no chance and try to do something as rigid as a locked room murder, for instance. That really interests me, though I don't know whether I'd be capable of writing it. Yeah, discovering how I veered from the discovery novels or mysteries was interesting for me.
And Christian is asking if you can talk a little bit more about the influence of Oulipo.
Sure. Especially in that it allows me to talk about a person I love who's no longer alive. His name is Harry Matthews. The Oulipo is the Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle, the workshop for potential literature. I first came across it through Raymond Queneau, who is one of its founders, along with François Le Lyonnais. And they both thought of ways of combining mathematics with literature. I have to admit that my fondness for them is in that they have taught me to read novels differently. When you think about structure, deep structure, when it occurs to you that a novel can be organized in ways that are very different from how you normally encounter novel creation, then you start to look at all novels you read for their buried structure. And that, in a way, was really influential on the genre writing that I did in the Quincunx. I used my ideas of genre, but also they all have a kind of 5-act structure. And so it was a constant examination of that kind of mathematical revelation of plot. The Oulipo, for me, it's interesting. To talk about Harry again, Harry and Raymond Queneau are believers in deities. I'm not sure whether I believe in God or not. I'm a confirmed agnostic. But I loved in their concentration on deep-lying structure and organization. It gave me a sense that the surface and the depths are different. And that, of course, is a classic notion of God, the invisible gardener. You see organization and therefore there is a God. I love that those two, the kind of surface and a deep structure, exist together. And it gives you the feeling either of paranoia or a feeling of a mysterious other order, which is part of what is attractive to me in the Oulipian, though I'm not myself an Oulipian at all. I've just been very influenced by their reading and thinking.
Okay, we have another influence question. I see a lot of similarities in the connections between the 5 books and the connections we see in the books of Michael Ondaatje. Is there a connection or influence there? Would you revisit and explore these characters in future books that aren't part of the 5?
2 questions. I think like a lot of people from my generation, I love Michael Ondaatje's work. And in fact, it's annoying to like his work as much as I do, because it means that when I see him or when we talk, I'm always aware that I'm talking to a book. I mean, there's a sense that I can't get at the person that is Michael Ondaatje when I talk to him, because I just keep thinking, oh, yeah, you're the guy that wrote, and all of these things were super important to me. There's an element of the random in literary families. Like I just encountered Ondaatje's work at a time when it was really important for me to think about Canada, to think about my culture from a different angle. And Michael does that, and does that in a way that's really interesting, but also Running in the Family, which is a novel, which is not a novel, it's a book that I adore. It felt like I could identify with the Sri Lanka of his growing up as well. So Michael is really, really important to me. I don't, however, write like him, except in one way. There is in Michael's work, every once in a while, an accumulation of very strange details. something that you might not have known, that is not maybe the part, maybe it comes from his research, but it's usually well put, and it's an estranging thing to find, like, this sharp detail in there. And I would say that of all the things that I've taken from Antachi's work, that's probably the major thing, this respect for the unusual detail. But I have to say, I don't think of his work in connection to these 5 in particular. But he's such an influence that it's likely that there are all sorts of connections that I'm simply not aware of. In the same way that you could probably read these novels and go, oh, that's where Margaret Lawrence lives, because she, like The Stone Angel, was huge for me. And to some extent, I feel like my writing novels comes from that exposure, the exposure to that.
One last question from Rick. I know you get a lot of comment about murdering 15 dogs. Do you get a lot of flack about the towns in Days by Moonlight?
No one from those towns has objected. They should, but no one has. The only kind of other town thing that has happened was that a principal at a school in Hornpain wondered if I would visit. Like, Hornpain's Northern Ontario, and I actually would. I really like those towns. I mean, I think, although in Days by Moonlight, Canada or Ontario is hell, purgatory, and heaven, they are like that because I adore Ontario, and I can see it in all of these different ways, without ill humor, without wishing it to be other. It's amusing to me to reconfigure it in that way, but I'm glad that it is what it is.
Alana, can I just ask you before we run away, as editor, did you edit the passages in which you appear? Was there any temptation to alter, or?
It was a little strange.
I expected you to say at some point, I wouldn't say that.
Andre did say he had more sympathy after writing me running away from authors thrusting manuscripts in my direction. Yeah, it was an odd moment. I can't thank both of you enough for your incredible conversation. It was very illuminating and I hope entertaining for all of our audience. Thank you so much for joining us. There's a link to buy the book in the chat if you want to do so, or please support your local independent bookstore. And thanks for coming out. Thanks to all of you, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Andre.
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you.
Bye.